Welcome, everyone. We'll get started here shortly as we allow people to come into the room.
Bienvenidos a todos. Vamos a comenzar en un momento. Vamos a permitir tiempo para que las personas se puedan unir a la reunión.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Lee. I work for the Solano County Water Agency, and I also am staff for the Solano Groundwater Sustainability Agency. We want to welcome you on behalf of the other GSAs that have worked together to develop the Solano Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Plan. We really appreciate you for attending tonight. We are recording this meeting and we'll dive into content in just a moment. And I'll be passing it on to Raina to introduce our interpretation features here shortly. And then after we talk about interpretation, Jen Fox of Ag Innovations will provide a brief introduction. So Raina, I'll turn it over to you.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. Bienvenidos a esta reunión virtual. Para esta reunión tendremos interpretación simultánea a través de la reunión. Para accesar la interpretación, en un momento usted abajo de su pantalla, si está en una computadora, va a ver un icono que parece un mundo. Si usted está usando un teléfono dispositivo o una tableta o otro tipo de aparato, sus opciones van a ser diferentes. Usted va a ver 3 puntitos que le dejan saber que tiene más opciones o more options, y allí también va a encontrar las mismas funciones. Cuando aparezca ya sea el mundo o los 3 puntitos, usted entonces va a seleccionar su lenguaje de preferencia. En este caso va a ser el español, seguido por Mute Original Audio o poner el audio original en silencio para que de esta manera usted solamente escuche la reunión en su lenguaje de preferencia y no escuche un eco. Si usted tiene cualquier pregunta o comentario, le invitamos a someter esas preguntas o comentarios en el lenguaje de preferencia y estaremos aquí para asistir. Bienvenidos.
Fantastic. Thank you, Raina. And as all of those of you who just heard, we're telecasting this meeting. We have simultaneous translation. So that was so folks could get into the Spanish channel. And we really appreciate you being here tonight. My name is Jen Fox, and I'm facilitating this evening. I'm going to give you one more brief Zoom intro for everybody on the call. There's a chat that we're going to use in a minute. Wanted to just show you what that button looks like. And there's also closed captions available. So those are 2 Zoom features that we wanted to make sure that you're aware of. But let's go ahead and kick off this evening. If we can go to the next slide, I'll just introduce myself. If we can go back 1 slide, I'm facilitating this evening, and my main role here tonight is to make sure that your questions get answered and that your input is heard and that we wrap up on time at 7 p.m. I'm going to go into the agenda in a minute. But first, I really want to thank everybody who's taking the time to be here. I work with a group called Ag Innovations, and we've held a number of these. And in a minute, we're going to ask you about your familiarity with them. Our team is leading the community engagement effort for the Solano Subbasin. And all of the folks that are here tonight, we all believe about the importance of community input, and we want to hear more about why you're here. So thank you, Chris, for the introduction, for kicking us off. Thank you all for joining us. And if we go to the next slide, I want to make sure that we know a little bit more about who's here. So I'm going to invite you to use the chat function. If you can go ahead and use the chat, type in your name, type in where in the Solano Subbasin you live, work, and or farm. And please type in why you're here tonight. So we'd love to see that in the chat. We want to help everybody see who's on the call. Thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you, Rich. It's great to have you here. I can see those of you on the call know that there's 62 participants here, and we have almost 100 who have registered. Kelly Huff from the Resource Conservation District, great to have you here. Folks from Rio Vista, a couple of you, Dixon Farmer here. It's really good to have you all here representing family farms, water districts, and other organizations. So want to invite you all to keep typing that into the chat. It's great to have somebody from the Department of Water Resources. Great to have Putah Creek here, a student. So you can see there's a lot of folks represented here on the call, a lot of areas, and we're really, really glad that you're all here. So I invite you to keep using the chat for a few more minutes to share a little bit more about why you're here and how you're connected to the Subbasin. And while you do that, I'm going to go on to the next slide. Thank you, Judy, for to just describe the goals for tonight. As you know from how you came from however you heard about the meeting, hopefully you know that we're here to talk about the funding that's needed for Groundwater Sustainability Plan implementation. In our last town hall in November, we sought a lot of input on the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. And I just want to catch folks up on the call who might not have been on the November town hall. That plan has since been submitted, and the implementation has begun, and we want to keep engaging with all of you about the implementation. So we also are going to take time to talk about what that means. We're going to start with that. And then we're going to also just have a really open forum about questions, anything you have about implementation, about funding, and or other topics. So we'll be talking a little bit at the beginning, but we are going to be encouraging a lot of interaction. If you want to go to the next slide, everyone will get a chance to see our proposed agenda for this evening. As I just mentioned, we'll spend a little bit on updates just to help everybody be in the same place in terms of that history. And then paying for GSP implementation. And as you can see, we've allotted the majority of our time for question and answer. So I want to turn it over to Chris in just a moment to ground us in the Solano Subbasin area and talk about the plan and funding. But before we do that, we want to know a little bit more about what has interested you on this call. So I'm going to invite Lupe to launch question 1 on a poll. In addition to you guys entering in the chat, you'll see on your screen, unless you're on a device that's not serviced, you'll see a chance to answer some questions. I'm seeing 9 of you have already answered those questions. We're asking you how many Solano Subbasin town halls that you have attended. So if you can just let us know. I'm noticing about 50% of you on the call are saying this is your first time attending a virtual town hall. So welcome. For those of you who have been to a few, some of this might be a little bit of a repeat, but I'm saying this out loud for the speakers so that we know that, you know, even some of the acronyms tonight may be new. It looks like 15% of the folks have attended one and 34% have attended more than one. So about half and half first timers and experienced folks in the virtual town hall. We're happy to have everybody. I'm ending that poll and I'm going to invite Lupe to share the second poll, if you don't mind. We'll ask you about how you heard about this event. So if you can share, Lupe, the second poll and tell us how you heard about this event. Great. So we've given you a few options here. If you heard from more than one location, that's fantastic. We're excited if we got the word out so much you heard in a few places, but choose the one that was kind of the predominant method. And then if anybody is choosing other, would just love to hear, to invite you to type in the chat. If there's something that wasn't reflected here, if you heard in a different way, please go ahead and type in the chat how you heard, if you heard in a different way. Great. Good. It looks like a few people still replying, but we've got more than 50% of the folks who participated, and I'll just share the results so everyone can see them. Looks like most of you heard from the Groundwater Sustainability Plan newsletter, and that's fantastic. Really great that you guys that we're getting the word out that way. And I'm seeing other folks who even found out via Hotmail. Good. One last question for you to help us guide our information tonight. I'm going to invite Lupe to share question 3. And this is a question about the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. And we're interested to understand, as I mentioned earlier, a number of you, even folks that I'm seeing on who typed into the chat, even helped to support the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. We're asking you, have you seen the sustainability plan? Have you interacted with it? And I invite you to respond to this third question so that we can know how familiar people are with the plan. Also, I wanted to mention, if you haven't yet seen the plan, please check it out. After we finish the survey, we're going to put the link to the plan. It's available both on the Department of Water Resources plan, website. It's also available on solanogsp.org or .com. Solanogsp.com is a great resource for a lot of what we're talking about tonight. It looks like 2/3 of you have responded to this poll. And so I'm going to end the poll, and I will also share the results to show that we, again, have a breadth of folks. You know, 1/5 of you have read and even commented on the plan. Another 40% have read the plan and or parts. But also a number of you have not read the plan. And so we'll make sure tonight to share information about where you can read the plan and to answer questions if you have those, whether you're familiar with it or not. Everybody is welcome, and we're really excited to have you here. And we'll be talking about both the Groundwater Sustainability Plan and a lot of other current events. And as you can see, Lupe has just entered into the chat where you can view the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, and that's in a user-friendly format. You can also find it on the DWR, the Department of Water Resources portal. So I'm going to turn to one last logistic note. We're going to close the chat because we want to move into a question and answer approach. And so you can see on the screen, everybody will have at the bottom of the screen now a question answer. And that's the function we're going to use so that we can make sure that we receive everyone's questions, and we can keep those, and we'll have, as I pointed out, a good 45 minutes to talk about those. And I think that's all the logistical notes I want to make. I want to thank you all. It's great to see how many of you are here, everything from North Vacaville Water District to Bishop Farm in the Upper Lagoon Valley, to folks on Puda Creek, hydrologists, students, ranch owners, engineers, walnut growers. So thank you guys all for being here. And Chris, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you to talk about the implementation and all the folks behind this work.
Thank you, Jen. So first, I'd really like to acknowledge the Solano GSA collaborative members and the respective board of directors who have developed this groundwater sustainability plan. So these include the Solano Irrigation District GSA, the City of Vacaville GSA, the Northern Delta GSA, Sacramento County GSA, and the Solano GSA, which I represent as a staff member. And I see we actually have a few board members joining us tonight. So welcome, everyone. So we've been working for more than 5 years now. The last 3 have really been concentrating on developing the groundwater sustainability plan. And again, really want to say thank you to many of you that are online with us tonight who have participated in many different ways, whether it be virtual town halls, other types of meetings and committees. Again, thank you so much for your participation. So my role as the plan administrator is really to be a facilitator of information to the various GSAs and the Department of Water Resources and local agencies and stakeholders such as yourself at these types of meetings that we've had over the last number of years. And really what I'm trying to do and all of these GSAs are trying to do is to make sure that our groundwater sustainability plan is compliant with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, so that we are protecting our valuable groundwater resources, to protect our important agriculture communities, as well as those communities that rely on groundwater as their only drinking water source, and really to make sure that we maintain our local control. As you're going to hear a few times tonight, we want to make sure that we are maintaining our local control so that the State Water Board doesn't come in and tell us to do more than they've already done through the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, to say that everything's been moving really fast is an understatement of all kinds of sorts. Really what we want to do is give you some context of where we are in implementing the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. So what we'll be sharing is a high-level timeline, more information about implementation activities, and really how you can get involved. And then we'll also have an update on the recent governor's executive drought order. Next slide, please. So this is a high-level look of our schedule, essentially looking back last December as the GSA boards adopted the GSP. At that same time, we actually sent out a request for proposals looking to start a rate study. And unfortunately, just like all the other subbasins in the state, everyone was in a frenzy all at the same time. So we actually didn't get any responses to our request and have started our charge study a little bit later than we had anticipated. Fortunately, through our great consultants, Ludorf and Scalamini, they went out and actually hired a local expert who has been helping us on this charge study since late February. In the interim, we also, as mentioned, we submitted the GSP to DWR in January. We submitted our first annual report on April 1st, and now we are actually implementing the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, which we'll get to here shortly. And then we're also, again, in the throes of looking at funding the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, which we'll talk about here shortly as well, and that potential fast-paced schedule. We do have another board meeting coming up with the Solano GSA board. We had hoped to be a little more ahead of schedule right now, but because of a bunch of different things going on, we're still not quite to the point where the Solano GSA board has decided on the exact methodology that they want to move forward on. What makes the most equitable sense for the Solano GSA. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward and talk about the funding aspect, because it will be kind of fast-paced. At the May 12th board meeting, the Solano GSA may come up with a methodology which may involve a Proposition 218 process, and there's some associated timelines that we'll discuss about that here shortly, and it moves very quickly. But the main point I really want to make there is that we want to maintain that local control. No one likes additional charges, but to move this plan forward and maintain our great groundwater resources, we do have to find funding to implement the GSP, because if we can't and we can't maintain that local control, the State Water Board can come in and they could potentially charge anywhere from 20 to 50 times what we're actually contemplating. So we certainly want to stay away from that. Next slide, please. So again, I'm sure that none of these expedited timelines are lost on any of you. It's sometimes hard to keep track of things on our end with all the different timelines and deadlines that are put before us. So as we just mentioned, we are now in the implementation phase of the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, even though DWR may take 2 years to actually review our plan. So it's a bit crazy at this point. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Nick Watterson. He's a principal hydrogeologist with Ludorf and Scalamini. And again, thanks to Ludorf and Scalamini for putting together our GSP ahead of schedule and submitting that to DWR. But Nick's going to be talking a little bit about what we've been doing so far for implementation activities for the GSP. All right, Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think we can move this, as Chris just noted. This slide outlines a lot of the different elements that are sort of concurrently going forward and involved in the implementation process, including annual reporting and monitoring that are required under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And I'm just going to give a brief little overview of what we presented on in the first annual report. And why don't we advance the slides, please? So as Chris noted, and some of you may certainly be aware of, we submitted the Groundwater Sustainability Plan in January of 2022. And according to the regulations, every April 1st of every year, subsequent to the submittal of the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, there's a requirement for an annual report submittal. There's a number of key elements that are required as part of that. The intent is to summarize the conditions in the sub-basin, and including groundwater levels, maps of groundwater level contours, elevations, some time series graphics showing trends of water levels through time, also summarizing groundwater extractions or pumping, surface water supplies, and a number of other different elements, including noting what steps have been occurring with respect to the implementation of the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. So we'll just talk a little bit about those things. Next slide, please. So the 2021 annual report, which we've provided a link in the chat, if you have interest in looking at it, it covers the water year 2021. So that spans the time frame of October 2020 to September 2021. You'll note that time frame actually predates the submittal of the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. But that's it's sort of this first annual report is somewhat of a catch-up, bringing our presentation of different aspects of the conditions in the basin up through present. Since as we were undertaking the preparation of the plan, the analyses had to stop at some point in order to move forward with preparing the plan. One thing that's notable in the 2021 annual report is certainly that many of you are aware of the recent dry conditions, and this graphic here is precipitation measured actually at the Davis station nearby to the sub-basin, showing annual precipitation as the bars, and then the black dashed line being the cumulative departure from the mean precipitation. So the black horizontal line being average. And what's particularly notable is water year 2021, which is the far right bar, blue bar, and 2020 being well below average. In fact, 2021 having less than 50% of average precipitation in the area. And then also notably being the period since 2020 where we are seeing well below average precipitation conditions. So if you were to take a punchline from the report and put it right here, the idea is that what we're seeing is that as a result of those dry conditions, we are seeing lowered water levels because of these drought circumstances in the basin. Next slide, please. So this is a this slide is just showing a map of some graphics of water levels measured in wells in the sub-basin, just as an example of what's in the report, and just to provide an illustration of some of the conditions that we are seeing. These are for the shallower part of the groundwater system, and as you can see, these particular examples are in the northern part of the sub-basin. And as we were noting, there have been some groundwater level declines more recently. When we look at we see these water level declines corresponding to these periods of dry and wetness in the sub-basin, including the more recent drought. But then you'll also see on some of these graphs that there are other periods that correspond to previous dry periods in the late 80s and early 90s, and then also in the 70s. So that's something that we're keeping an eye on with time here. Also notable on some of these graphs is the historical influence of the completion of the Solano project. and the rise in water levels that occurred at the time of the completion of that project. So next slide, please. And when we look at things at a sub-basin scale with respect to groundwater extraction and changing groundwater storage, which are shown here, the upper graph being groundwater extraction, bars going downward, the farther down they go, that's the more extractions occurring. In water years 2020 and 2021, had about approximately 240,000 acre feet of groundwater extracted in each of those 2 years. Prior to that, the values were more along the lines of 150,000 to 200,000 acre feet. So because of the dry conditions, there's certainly been more groundwater extraction occurring in these last 2 years. And then in the lower graph, you'll see these are changes in groundwater storage. The bars going up above the baseline of 0 are increases in storage. Bars going downward are decreases in storage, and similarly, those you see some corresponding decreases in groundwater storage in these 2 recent years. It's certainly notable that we expect that there is natural variability with the hydrology, ups and downs, and so it's important to keep in mind that the vision is looking at this over the long term. I will just note, in the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, we did look at the conditions over a base period that had a representative hydrology, average hydrology, and we saw that those conditions over that period were roughly, approximately stable. So next slide. And as we go forward, we'll continue to track groundwater conditions. There's a lot of monitoring that are planned in order to make sure that the sustainability of the subbasin is maintained. Another element that's going on with that is also identifying and filling some data gaps that were identified in the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, making sure that any areas where we identified incomplete information and want to complement our understanding of conditions in the basin, that we are able to do that. And then a key aspect is moving forward with implementation of projects and management actions that are identified in the subbasin. A key focus there is really enhancing groundwater recharge opportunities. And there are many different ways, and we've identified a handful of opportunities that we think are suitable for the subbasin. And so that's an area where the subbasin is going to continue to pursue, trying to supplement and recharge. And then with that goes outreach to potential interested parties that may be interested in implementing some of these actions or management or projects, and looking to coordinate on those things. And then I'd say lastly, one of the key things that's ongoing is pursuing grant opportunities. Most recently, the subbasin has collaborated with the resource conservation districts in a number of them, including the Dixon and Solano RCDs in the subbasin, but also others in the Sacramento Valley, to apply for a Department of Conservation grant that involves multi-benefit projects to support the water resources and habitat in the area. And I believe that the award notice on that is expected to occur sometime this month. And there's also a forthcoming opportunity through the Department of Water Resources through the Sustainable Groundwater Management grant program, and that is for implementation of groundwater sustainability plans. And that is planned for sometime in the September fall of this year timeframe. So a lot going on, and a lot to come. As we just noted, we're just the plan was submitted in January. We've been focused on some annual reporting and monitoring, and are really trying to gear up on some of these other elements, and continue to implement this plan, and make sure that we sustain the groundwater conditions and water resource conditions in the subbasin. So I think with that, I was going to turn it back over to Chris to just briefly touch on the executive order that he mentioned, and I'll leave that to you, Chris.
Thanks, Nick. And there's actually a couple of questions on your presentation, if you wouldn't mind checking those out.
Of course, yes.
Okay, well, unfortunately, as you're all aware, we are in the midst of another drought here in California. The governor issued a drought executive order N-7-22 at the end of March that included new well permitting requirements for local agencies to prepare for and lessen the effects of drought conditions. This executive order does not change Solano County's existing well permit authority, but it did add some new things that we need to look at. So under action item number 9, well permitting agencies now must consult with the GSAs and receive written verification from the GSAs that proposed well locations are consistent with the GSP and will not decrease the likelihood of achieving the sustainability goals that the GSAs have developed in the GSP. In addition, Solano County in particular, when we're looking at the well applications, have to also show that the new wells are not going to interfere with existing wells and also won't have any cause for subsidence, which could impact or damage nearby infrastructure. In some meetings that we've had with the Department of Water Resources, we have heard that there's not going to be any state oversight, enforcement, or reporting required. DWR is also not going to issue any guidelines, and essentially they want it to stay at the local level. Initially, we had thought that this was going to be a temporary order tied to the drought. Unfortunately, there is a new assembly bill, AB 2201, that looks to potentially make this into law. And that bill is currently looking to move out of the committee. And we actually have the water agency's lobbyist is tracking this assembly bill right now to see where it's at. I know from the water agency's perspective, it's very likely that we will probably be sending in an opposition letter to this assembly bill. And it's something that we would probably be bringing back to the Solano GSA board to consider commenting on as well. It's actually quite burdensome on the well applicants to prove no harm to the subbasin or their neighbors. But that's a current requirement of the executive order. And then in another turn, last week, this assembly bill was amended, and it now looks like if this bill gets passed, it will require the GSAs to post well applications on their website for 30 days prior to approval for public comment. And that could be really disastrous for emergency well replacements during the ag season or otherwise, if there's a small water system that is relying on groundwater as their only drinking water source. So in the interim, we're going to continue to work with Solano County staff and other GSAs to develop some draft policy to determine the procedures and coordination verification. And then once we have a draft, we'll bring that to the Solano GSA board for consideration so that we can hopefully move forward and again, not make this as burdensome as it currently seems under this executive order. Fortunately, the Solano GSA board has approved some emergency provisions to provide consistency determinations for applications of replacement wells that have stopped producing or failed. They honestly feel that we can't have growers and ranchers waiting too long, or small water systems that rely on groundwater as their only drinking water source. We have to avoid that at all if possible. So stay tuned for more information on that. And if we have more information, we'll provide that on the Solano GSP website. Next slide, please. We're going to be talking about GSP implementation funding, essentially how we're going to be paying for all those actions that are necessary to maintain our compliance with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And I'll be honest, we had hoped to share more information with you tonight, but like everything else, time constraints have gotten a bit problematic as late. As I mentioned earlier, we've gotten a bit behind in starting the charge study. Again, no fault to our consultants. They've been fantastic in helping us in this whole process. But we scheduled this meeting several months back, knowing what our time frame was, and we had thought that we'd be able to share some real numbers with you tonight, and that's just unfortunately not the case. We're going to share more about where we're potentially headed And to be fair, the Solano GSA board is really taking their time on determining the most equitable funding methodology to move forward, to make sure that we're not only complying with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, but to make sure that it's fair and equitable for all the stakeholders within the Solano GSA. As I mentioned earlier, no one likes additional fees, but we do need to pay for this plan, because if we don't, the State Water Board could really put us in a bind and charge a lot more. So again, the Solano GSA is taking a little more time to figure this out. And as I mentioned earlier, their next meeting is May 12th, and they'll be deciding that in a closed session, but hopefully making some movement forward and bringing that out in open session to discuss a path forward. So really, we had a starting point of looking at each of the GSAs, how much groundwater they're being used, to try to look and see what was equitable for cost for the implementation actions. And essentially, this is what every single GSP within the state has used as their starting point. And a lot of them are at different points where they're looking at different costs for extraction of groundwater and things like that. Again, we're trying to stay away from that, to try to be a little more simplistic if it's possible here, given, again, with the stability of our subbasin and our great monitoring network in place, we can hopefully cut some costs here and there. But for more information, tune in to the May 12th Solano GSA board meeting. They'll be, again, discussing what methodology makes the most sense, and hopefully we'll be bringing that forward. There is a possibility that one of the mechanisms they look at is a Proposition 218 process, and we'll talk a little bit about that for the next few slides and what they might mean for the short term. And they may be taking another look at long-term funding to see, again, what makes the most sense, looking at all the different nuances of all the different types of water users we have just within the Solano GSA, not the subbasin, but just within our GSA. And so, again, look for that information to come out. Wish I had a little more to tell you on that, but again, we're not trying to make a rush decision tonight. And I also want to point out that this is not a public hearing on the charges. Neither will the May 12th meeting be a public hearing. If the Solano GSA board does decide to move forward with some type of public process, like a Prop 218, there will be a public hearing at a later date, but that will occur a few months from now. Next slide, please. Okay, as has been mentioned several times, we have submitted our Groundwater Sustainability Plan to DWR. We now have 20 years to show the state that we are managing our subbasin in a sustainable manner. And then we have to maintain that sustainability for 30 plus years after that. Again, fortunately, if you've had a chance to look at our GSP, we are very fortunate, as mentioned, with the surface water deliveries of the Solano project. We're in quite stable shape. We have a few areas that we want to concentrate on look a little closer, but in general, we're looking pretty good. So we are in this for the long haul. Conditions may change over time, but we will need to continuously fund this program. And we do have to do major updates to the GSP every 5 years, and we'll probably be looking at our funding strategies probably at similar time intervals, or we may be looking at them maybe in shorter time intervals if that's more appropriate, as we get more data, as we get more input from stakeholders. So again, we'll make that an iterative process as we move forward. We want to make sure that we're not stuck with a one size fits all. Next slide, please. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jacques Debras from Ludorf and Scalmini, who's going to walk through kind of what we really have to look at for funding over the next 50 years. Jacques?
Hi, I'm Jacques Debray with the Ludorf and Scalmini team, and we are working with your region to develop, the Groundwater Sustainability Plan and then set you up for future implementation. And this slide really just does a great job of showing everyone that by adopting the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, it's really just the beginning, and that from the SGMA compliance state regulation perspective, their expectation is that the GSAs in Solano County are going to spend the next 50 years focused on implementing a wide variety of activities to maintain sustainability, but also meet regulatory requirements. So we just wanted to show you that slide so you had that perspective So Chris Lee with the GSA mentioned that in looking at the long-term funding strategy, the board has looked at all options, and one path forward would be to pursue what's called a Proposition 218 process to establish a long-term funding mechanism that would be dedicated to all the GSP activities that we just shared with you, and to maintain Sigma compliance and kind of keep the state on the other side of the county boundary going forward. And so just a few things about this approach is that we want to make sure we establish charges that are reasonable for the first 5 years of GSP implementation. So the focus would be over the next 5 years through 2027. And we'd want to make sure that the charges are equitable and fairly easy to understand and implement, because we don't want any extra costs to implement charges that the board may approve ultimately as a long-term strategy. And then we also just wanted to highlight that we needed to allocate the costs that drive what the charges could be in the future based on groundwater use in the different GSAs in the subbasin. So this really allows an allocation of costs based on groundwater use, which was looked at as an equity mechanism. So anyway, this is the report we're working on, and it's one of the things the board will be discussing at their meeting on May 12th. So when you look at a long-term funding mechanism, for example, Proposition 218, there is a set process we have to follow, and that's so that there's transparency for those that would be subject to the charge, and that there's ample time for public notification. So we just put this timeline together for you to see that we started working on the long-term funding plan right after the GSP was adopted at the start of 2022. We looked at options in the spring, and we're here today doing outreach to make sure everyone's on board with the funding needs and how we go forward together. And then at the May 12th board meeting, if the board feels it's appropriate, they'll approve the Proposition 218 charge report that would give them the option to adopt a proposed charge at a future date. And then subsequently, to follow the Proposition 218 outreach process, we'd send out a Prop 218 notice to all those that could be assessed a charge of that nature, so that they have an understanding well in advance of before the board ever considers action. And then tentatively, we have the July 14th board meeting set. If the board's comfortable with proceeding with the proposed Prop 218 charge, they would conduct a public hearing at their regular July meeting and then take action to approve the proposed charges. One of the components of Prop 218, not to go into the weeds, but we send out a notice to inform those of the proposed charge, but also there's an opportunity to protest. So if you file a protest, those protests will be counted in the reconciliation of the Prop 218 process when the board considers that at their July meeting. And then if a charge is approved, because a Prop 218 charge would be promulgated through the property tax roll in Solano County for those subject to the fee, we would need to get the final information to the assessor's office by the end of July, and then the charges would actually take effect in December of 2022. So we just wanted to let you know that there's a process we have to follow. It's transparent, and those are the steps we're going to move through.
Great, and this is a good time to remind folks that please do type in your questions, and you not only we're going to go to a discussion about these, but it's been great to answer a bunch of them, and yeah, when Chris is ready, we'll talk a little bit more about the Solano Collaborative and then turn to a question answer. So feel free to type in your questions as we go.
Hey, Jen, maybe I'll highlight before Chris gets started briefly that, because people might be wondering, if a Proposition 218 charge long-term funding approach is utilized, who would that apply to? It would only apply to the Solano GSA. The other GSAs are going to pursue their own funding plan, and they'll make contributions through a regional MOU to actually implement the groundwater sustainability plan. So I thought I would just highlight that, Jen.
Yeah, thanks, Jacques. And that's exactly what I was going to cover in this slide here. Each of the other GSAs, City of Vacaville or SID, they have existing funding mechanisms in place. And as Jacques said, the Solano GSA is a relatively new agency. We do not have a funding mechanism in place. And that's, again, what the Solano GSA board is looking at right now, what methodology makes the most sense. And again, as I mentioned before, this is a lot of information for them to look at all at once, and they do not want to rush the process. That's why it's taken them a couple of meetings, and we're hoping at their next meeting that we have enough time for them to look at all the different alternatives that are out there and see what makes the most sense for our Solano GSA moving forward. And at this point, I think I'll turn it back over to you, Jen.
Great, yeah, and I'm going to turn it back to everybody in the audience. And I think what I'd like to do, if we can go to the next slide, I want to actually, if you go back just 1 minute, I just want to highlight two things. If we go back one slide, no, forward to the GSAs, just a huge thank you for the groups that you see here who not only, as Chris said, are working on things like the executive order, et cetera, but also worked on the groundwater sustainability plan with input. We heard a third of you on the call even weighed in. So I just want to note one big picture thing. First of all, that the basin is currently sustainable and that the goal is to keep it that way. And we talked about that very much at the November meeting, which I know a number of you were not at. Second, that there's a plan in place to do a lot of this work. And so, for example, I noticed one question that came in the Q&A that talked about how much is this going to cost. There's a whole section 9 in this plan that talks about the costs. And third, I also just want to reiterate what Chris brought up at the beginning of this section, which is that this is not a public hearing today. This is an information session. We want to hear your questions, and we want to talk about answers to them. And also, as you've heard, there are some things that we can't answer yet, or that we'll know more in a week. So we'll be very transparent about that. So with that, if we go to the next slide, just want to give a reminder, as we have over 70 folks on the call, a few folks joined late. This is how you participate in the question answer session, and we're going to turn to some of those questions. And so what I'm going to do is invite the panelists to turn on your camera, and we can switch to a gallery mode so that you can see our faces and we can talk about some of the questions. And I'm going to start with a few questions. So Judy, if you want to turn off the slides, stop sharing your screen, and we'll go on to gallery mode and jump into the question answer. So please keep typing in some questions. I've seen some coming in as we speak. And why don't I start with a couple notes, just to give a chance. There were some really good questions that came up already, and I want to make sure that we jump through those. I saw over 6 questions just on the groundwater sustainability plan, and some of those were very specific. Nick has given a bunch of great, very specific answers. But Nick, why don't I turn to you first and invite you if there's any answers that you want to describe more on, or in particular, I know Herb asked, please explain how you will know what level of extraction was over time, and what the data source for that is. So if you wouldn't mind just adding a little more to that, and also any other of the questions about the monitoring, or any parts of your presentation that you haven't had a chance to answer.
Sure. Well, I'll certainly answer Herb's question, which was, about how do we know, or what is the data source for the groundwater extractions that they were reported in the annual report, and I think the answer in the Q&A, does explain it, but I'll elaborate just a little bit. So we have a hydrologic model that we've used in the that we developed during the process of preparing the groundwater sustainability plan, and it's also a powerful tool for other analyses. So for the annual reporting, we took reported information on pumping from wherever there is monitored data, meters, and so that's largely, in most cases, ends up being urban pumping. But there are some cases, in the case primarily of Solano Irrigation District, where there is some groundwater metered groundwater pumping, and so we folded those data in, and then also did an analysis based on analyses of what the total water demand is based on cropping and land use information, and then related that to sources of water like precipitation that are falling on the landscape that may meet some of that demand, surface water deliveries that in some cases may come to meet some of that demand, and then the result is an estimation of what remaining demand there is primarily assumed to be met from groundwater pumping. So that's sort of the way that the modeling estimates go. That's an area where we're certainly looking to refine that understanding, and that we've got some approaches and methods that we are hoping to employ that are included in some of the grant applications that have already been submitted, the one to the Department of Conservation, and so we'll continue to try to refine those estimates as we go forward. But that is the method that's been used to date. I think one of the other questions that came up was related to the graphic of precipitation, which was used as an example from a Davis station, and the Davis station has a long period of record, and that's why that was used as an example. That we're not meaning to imply that we are interpreting that precipitation to be representative of the entire subbasin. It's just it was an illustration of what the trends in precipitation have been in the region, recognizing that it varies across the subbasin, and so those data across the subbasin where available are integrated into our analyses of the water budget components, including the estimates of groundwater extraction. So I just wanted to, that's just a point of clarification on that. And I think those were kind of the two key questions. I don't know, Jen, were there any other that jumped out to you that you think I should address?
Yeah, I guess one that came in while you were speaking, Malin asks, if the basin is sustainable now, is there any idea of how many more wells the basin can handle and still be sustainable? Yeah.
Great question. I think we do have a, it's always hard to forecast out, beyond, but what we do have in the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, we do have we have tried to look for, to project forward 50 years to look at potential land use changes, and so with that, we do have a sense, and we've estimated what the sustainable yield of the subbasin is, and so that does give us some sense. I wouldn't put a number on how many wells that is. There's a lot of things that certainly factor into that, but we do think that the basin is sustainable. We do think that there's an opportunity, continues to be natural changes in land use are, that we think that the subbasin can accommodate those and maintain sustainability. But as far as how many wells that might be is something that I wouldn't want to really, venture into.
Yeah, thanks. Good. Well, I'm seeing a few of the questions that are coming in right now, top of the list, are really about the charges. And so I think, let me just mention them right now. Stuart asks, will fee rates be based on the actual amount of water being used? And kind of a similar question is from Rich. what might an ag owner expect to pay via annual property taxes? Chris, maybe you can mention a little bit more about what is known right now about possible charges and what is being studied.
Kind of. So I can't get very specific at this point, again, because the Solano GSA board is still deciding on the actual methodology of how we will fund our GSA portion for the GSP. What I can tell you is that what has been done in other parts of the state is essentially looking at the annual costs of implementing the groundwater sustainability plans. And then if there are multiple GSAs, such as what we have here, each of those GSAs also have additional cost requirements for overall administration, things of that nature. So some of those costs are also built into that process. And then what we've also seen in many other parts of the state is that depending on how much groundwater is extracted or some other equitable ratio is used for each of the GSAs, they're paying into a kind of a kitty that's being used to do the overall GSP implementation actions for the entire subbasin. So again, the Solano GSA board is contemplating all of the different scenarios out there at this point. I can't give you a dollar figure of what that might look like. We're hoping that maybe at the May 12th meeting or shortly thereafter, we will be able to provide you with what that dollar amount will look like, or there may be some variations of that moving forward. But at this point, unfortunately, we can't really provide anything specific more than that.
All right, great. I'm going to turn, there also is a group of questions that I want to make sure we get time to address that deal with some of the more recent, the executive order and the more recent AB 2201. So just one reminder, and for anyone who joined late, the state assembly bill that Chris mentioned is AB 2201. That has not yet passed. And Chris, I just want to invite, do you want to mention anything more about that?
Obviously there's been a number of these types of bills in the past that have tried to go through the legislature and have not moved out of various committees that they've been in. This one has a little more traction because it's tied so closely to the governor's executive order that was issued at the end of March for the drought that we're actually in right now. And so we're tracking this very closely, and it's unfortunate, you know, right in the middle of the ag season that we have something on us that where we have a failed well, or a well that's not producing as much groundwater that's needed for whatever application of agriculture is going on the field. You know, a grower or a rancher can be stuck at this point. And so we're trying to figure this out as best we can, given the limited information that we've received from the state, both Solano County through the well permit program and the various GSAs that are in the subbasin. Want to make sure that we're being compliant with the executive order, and looking forward to the assembly bill and what that may actually mean. But in the interim, as I mentioned in the chat, we are working with Solano County staff to come up with some draft policy to try to reduce the time that it's going to take to do these certifications for these well applications coming in. And unfortunately, we're not there yet. We've just started having these discussions. We've had a meeting or two with Solano County. And so we're going to be working as quickly as we can to try to put something together for the GSA boards to look at, for the Solano County supervisors to look at, to make sure we have the best procedure moving forward that is as a policy that makes sense, is compliant with the various executive orders and potential laws coming our way, but also as least burdensome as possible for well applicants. And that's a lot to chew on right now. So I do apologize, I don't have a better answer for you, but we are certainly working on it as quickly as we can.
Great, yeah. Okay, thanks for that. I think, let me turn to a question from Sabine, and we're going to move away from the executive order and AB 2201. I think this question refers to what was talked, and Sabine, please type in if this is not the case, but Sabine asked, will voters need to approve this new tax? I think Sabine is referring to the charges that would be required for the Groundwater Sustainability Plan implementation. So Jacques, would you like to just touch on that?
Yes, that's a great question. So one of the long-term funding sources that the board is looking at is the Proposition 2 and 8 charge process. And if they pursue that, they would, as I mentioned before, notify all those subject to the fee in advance of action. So they would be notified at least 45 days before a public hearing would be conducted by the board. And then at that hearing is when under Prop 2 and 8, the vote is really called a majority protest. So each parcel subject to the charge would have an opportunity to file a protest. And so those protests will be recorded and considered before the board takes action on a proposed charge.
Great. And while we're on this topic, I know Chris is actually typing in an answer right now, but Herb asked about, is this fee, is it intended to fund improvement projects, or are improvement projects funded by grants? Do you want to just mention that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as Chris mentioned, there's a long-term funding strategy that the GSA has, and it's important to note that the Prop 2 and 8 charge, that is focused on the Sigma compliance activities and a lot of what Nick was talking about, but there's a whole separate funding need for actual projects that could be implemented by various proponents or entities that are part of the various GSAs in the subbasin, where they would have to find additional or other funding sources to fund those actions. So we just want to be clear about that's a whole separate funding strategy. And I think Nick was highlighting that we can pursue some of those needs through the upcoming DWR implementation grant funding cycle that will be available later this year.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so there's two questions right now in the queue, and I'll just I'll read one of them. I think there's another one that was just answered, but there's a question about why are housing developments being allowed to proceed in areas that rely on groundwater? So I think this gets back to a question on the groundwater. Yeah, I'll just read that question from Matt. And Chris or Nick, do one of you want to touch on that?
Sure. I guess every city in the state of California is required by law to show that they have adequate water sources for any new housing units that come in. And it's such a weird thing here. We're talking about groundwater, and looking at the subbasin as a whole, we are in quite stable condition. But because there are so many requirements for these groundwater sustainability plans, all the monitoring and the data analysis and the reporting, that's what's driving up the costs here locally. The actual amount of groundwater we have is not really an issue at this point. It's something we want to keep an eye on and manage sustainably. But again, because of our fairly abundant surface water supplies, we are in pretty good shape compared to a lot of other spots in the state. And so we want to make sure that maintains moving forward in the future. And so really, the amount of groundwater we have is not a huge issue. There are a few areas like in the Northwest focus area where we certainly need to look and see, there's a few kind of interesting nuances going on there that we want to take a closer look at. But as a whole, we're in pretty good shape. So all the cities do have to look at and make sure they do have water sources.
Thanks. Good. There was another question in there that I'm going to answer. It was a question about, and I invite others to weigh in too. Somebody had asked earlier, will we be going back to in-person meetings soon? And I think somebody even typed in an answer, but I just want to take a moment selfishly to mention that we are at the end of the meeting, we're going to share a survey, and we have one, just an open-ended question. we're actually looking for feedback on that. We actually, and as demonstrated tonight by the fact that we had well over 70 people attend this meeting, we've heard that the live meetings can be very useful for people to attend, but we also think that, we want to be able to have these kind of conversations in the way that work best for folks. So Lupe, if you wouldn't mind, I know we'll do this again at the end of the meeting, but if you wouldn't mind, thank you. Lupe's already done it, shared the feedback form. There's both an English and a Spanish version. And there's an open-ended question on that for any kind of feedback that you want to supply. And it also is really good feedback for us about how you want to hear this information and how you want to ask questions and how we can really be in dialogue with you. We'll be sharing some slides that talk about ways to stay engaged, but I wanted to make sure if anybody needs to leave early, please do use that form and give feedback about that. I know somebody also answered this by typing in. Does anybody want to add to this? When will we go back to in-person meetings soon?
Well, depending on the situation, some of the boards have been meeting in person for some time now, and there's a lot of hybrid situations. So the Solano GSA board and Solano County Water Agency board have been doing hybrid meetings, and it's actually nice to get in a room and talk to people and see each other's faces and read body language and try to understand and communicate with one another and coordinate like we have in the past. And really, again, I just want to show appreciation to all the stakeholders that have participated in this whole process where we started meeting in person, and everyone went through the pandemic and we met online for the last 2+ years now, and hoping, we are coming out of that and meeting in person more frequently. And for those that want to, we'll provide those hybrid situations as well, but I look forward to that.
Yeah, me too. Great. And I think one of the things about those conversations, and one thing we've tried to mimic here, and I just want to encourage folks, there's 31 answered questions in that panel, and everybody can see those answered questions. Encourage you to just take a few moments and look at the answers. I just want to observe that they are running the gamut, in terms of people's interests. And we appreciate that shows that there's a lot going on here. Everything from, questions about monitoring and extraction and what data sources are being used to look at that, to, the assembly bill that is nascent right now, to the executive order, to charge questions. And maybe I just want to make sure we give adequate time to the executive order. So Chris, I'm going to turn to you. I know we've answered a couple of these in there, but just want to maybe repeat to see if there's anything else you'd like to add. I know the guidelines are under development, but Nathan does ask, has the Solano GSA come up with any guidelines yet about what they will allow when it comes to new wells? I think there's a similar question from Jim about, will Solano County issue permits for groundwater test boring? So would you want to touch base on kind of some of those related questions?
Sure. Again, and this is just staff talking out loud. We have to vet everything with the Solano GSA board, as Solano County staff also have to vet everything with their county supervisors for their well permit program. But again, as I just mentioned, with the stability of our subbasin, we are hoping to create a policy or / procedures that, again, that kind of mimic the existing Solano County permit process. And we'll probably have some type of decision tree. Is this a new well? Where's it going in? What part of the subbasin? As I mentioned earlier, we have this northwest focus area that has seen some declines over the last couple decades that we want to take a little closer look at. So wells going in that area may need a closer look, and we're going to have to talk to Solano County again. The question of subsidence, I don't think is going to be an issue here. We've got a lot of subsidence monitoring stations show that that's just not an issue within our subbasin, again, because of the stability of our subbasin. But the question of interference, are we affecting the neighbor's well? That's something we have to look at and determine, how do we even figure that out? So there's a lot of questions still to determine to make sure we are compliant with the executive order, and if there's a new law to come out, that we're compliant with that, but also not slowing down the process. We don't want to get in the way, because we've got a great agricultural tradition here in Solano County. We want that to continue. We know there are some small water systems out there where people rely on groundwater as their only drinking water source. We don't want to get away in those. We want to help those people. So again, we're trying to get through this as fast and as quickly as we can, but we also have to make sure that we are compliant and we make sure that we put something together that makes sense for all of our individual boards.
Great, thanks, Chris. And related to that, there is a question right now about working with other GSAs that are bordered. And so I guess I know it looks like Vicky's answering this, but do you want to mention anything about working with other GSAs that are bordering? Yeah.
What we're hoping is to draft up a policy again right now with Solano County and share that information with the other GSAs so that we have the same information across the entire sub-basin, so that landowners that have property in one GSA and property in another GSA aren't hearing different stories. We want to make sure that we have the same information for all landowners, no matter where they're at in the sub-basin. So we are absolutely talking to the other GSAs to make sure we coordinate those efforts.
Good. And I'm seeing just a couple more questions trickling in. So want to invite people to take the last few minutes. If you have a question you want to ask and it hasn't already been covered in the 32 that have been answered, please feel free to type it in and we'll do our best to answer them. I'm going to come back to one that was just asked. Someone asked, is the GSA meeting on May 12th via Zoom for all to participate? And I just want to make sure that that answer was seen by folks because all are able to participate. It's a hybrid meeting and there's a Zoom link posted on the scwa2.com website for that board meeting. So just want to make sure that folks saw that. And again, like today, that's not a public hearing, but it is a board meeting open to all. Anything else you want to add on that?
No, I think you covered it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Jacques, I just want to invite you. I know you're also seeing some of the questions coming in. Anything that you think needs clarification on the Proposition 218 process?
Yeah, I think I want to highlight the deliberate and sincere effort on the part of all the GSAs to take a hard look at what are the costs to comply with SGMA, how can we work together to keep the costs as reasonable as possible. And there's going to be a lot of documentation on what we call the revenue needs. What's the revenue that's needed so the GSAs can cover their costs, the administrative costs, as Chris was highlighting, but also there's adequate revenues to cover the GSP implementation costs, which is a lot of what Nick was talking about. And so together that represents the revenue needs for the GSAs throughout the sub-basin. So for example, when the Solano GSA considers their long-term funding needs, they're going to consider what are the revenue needs to comply with SGMA in their GSA service area, but also recognizing that if they're in compliance, it helps the whole sub-basin comply with SGMA as well. So it's really a team effort, and I think that's going to bode well for keeping the costs down as low as possible in the future.
Thanks, Jacques. Yeah. And just want to turn back. There was one question that just came in from Rich, and just want to note that it was answered live, but recharge opportunities, you know, they're while we're paying for this, the work is certainly happening. And Rick's question was answered, and I just want to highlight that even though we're right now a sustainable sub-basin, the GSAs are always looking at recharge opportunities, and will be coming to you. I know we talked about that in the November meeting, and that's another thing. You can use the survey form to provide any feedback, but we're hoping to focus a sub-basin newsletter on how folks can get involved in the recharge opportunities. So want to make sure that doesn't get lost in the list of all those answered questions. Vicki, do you want to add anything to that?
So it's spot on because we're experiencing these back-to-back, very dry years, finding ways to retain and facilitate movement of any surplus water into the subsurface to recharge the system is something we definitely want to do in the future to help mitigate these very dry conditions.
Thanks, Vicki. Great. I'm looking at the questions coming in. I'm not seeing any open ones. Want to give one last chance for anyone else to add anything to questions that they have answered, or other ones that we should make sure and highlight. Great. One that just came in, Nathan asks, is Solano GSA working with Yolo County GSA at all? Chris, do you want to just answer that live?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I had a phone conversation with Kristen Sicky today. She's the executor for the Yolo GSA. And so we have been meeting with our neighboring and adjacent subbasins for several years now, and it's kind of ramped up. And as we were all getting towards completion of our GSPs, and we've talked with Yolo probably the most, because we're just downstream of them, as it were, from a groundwater perspective. And we actually have purposely looked at extending our groundwater model into Yolo County, just to see if there are effects of what they're doing or vice versa, so that we will have more information to talk with them. And this Northwest focus area is something that is kind of happening on the other side of the creek as well. They've kind of addressed it a little bit by changing how they deliver water. They're trying to get more surface water to the northern part of above Poudre Creek there and west of Winters. And so we're again talking to them about looking at monitoring wells across Poudre Creek to see, is there some additional information or analysis that we can gain from, partnering in those types of efforts. So absolutely, we are coordinating with all of our neighboring and adjacent GSAs.
Great, thanks. All right, well, Judy, if you wouldn't mind, let's go ahead and we'll put back up slide 30 and we can talk about some next steps. I think, first of all, I want to thank everybody on the panel, but also thank everybody for your really good questions. You're already thinking forward to some of these steps, like coordination with Yolo County, like what will it take to comply with the governor's executive order? And I want to give a chance for folks, again, there's been 36 questions in here, but I want to give a chance, if you go back one, Judy, I want to give a chance for folks. Lupe, I'm going to ask you to type back in the survey that you shared before. So this is the same one that we shared about 15 minutes ago for anyone who had to leave early. But while it's fresh, I really ask people, we're going to give just a minute here. Please open those forms and give us your feedback while it's fresh. We want to know where people are calling in from. We want to know the best way to give to share information, to make sure that you know about the public meeting opportunities, to make sure that we're getting your ideas on recharge and some of the many ideas that you were sharing even in the discussion today. So please take a moment to go ahead and open that. And I also just want to mention, there was a slide earlier that you saw of the different GSAs. The contact information for all of those GSAs is on solanogsp.com. Chris talked about coordination within the Solano Collaborative and also beyond, and just want to mention that those folks have been essential in this work, and that if you have specific questions for your GSA, please don't hesitate to reach out to them. Additionally, I'm going to turn it to our next slide, and Chris, invite you to just stress any of these next steps. Judy, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, want to just also mention and do a huge shout out to Guadalupe at Ag Innovations, who has said, help to get this meeting together, help to translate into Spanish, and has been an incredible resource answering questions that come in. So Chris, before I turn it to you, I'm gonna just invite Vicki to say something else. Yeah, Vicki.
Just one quick note, as you're talking about the GSA contacts, We're also working on an interactive map where individuals located in the area will be able to identify what GSA they're located in. So that will be coming soon, and probably through Ag Innovations or through the GSA send out a notice about when that becomes available. But keep an eye on the website because it's coming soon.
Great, thanks for that addition. I know that's going to be really helpful to folks. So yeah, Chris, anything you want to say about next steps and ways to stay engaged?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And both you and Vicki have pointed out, we have a fairly robust website, www.solanogsp.com. And as Jen said, we'd love for you guys to stay involved. We've got a core group of you that have been with us for almost the entire process for a number of years now. And we really thank you for all your guidance and input and comments and questions and suggestions. And we have taken them to heart, and we really want you to continue to provide that information. So go to the website, as Jen said, check out which GSA meetings are going on. You can sign up for the newsletter if you already are signed up for that. There's additional information on the water guide, a bunch of other resources, a lot of frequently asked questions on groundwater, and events, new meetings that are coming up. All that information will be posted there on the website. So again, I just want to thank everyone for participating tonight, and for those that are here for the first time, welcome. Those that have we know are familiar faces, thanks once again for providing great input on all of these meetings. That's really helped us and will continue to help us as we move forward, and as we all want to protect these important groundwater resources here within the Subbasin moving forward. So thanks again, everyone, and good night.
Thank you and gracias. And we'll be closing the Spanish channel and closing the recording. And again, that recording will be available at solanogsp.com.